War of the Worlds: The Resurrection. A novel by J.M. Dillard. Chapter 10. About 35 miles from anywhere, the tiny burg of Brewster sat just off exit 92, smack in the middle of the Mojave Desert. The town consisted of one gas station, one Safeway, one electrical appliance store, May's dress shop, a Baptist bookstore, 3 churches, and 4 auto parts stores between there and Schuylerville, the neighboring town with which Brewster shared one sheriff, his deputy, and their patrol car. It was late afternoon, and the sun was just getting ready to slip below the horizon and take the heat with it. Inside the display window at Crutchen's Electronics, 4 19-inch Sony color TV sets were all tuned to the same channel, a local independent station that aired mostly reruns. A rowdy group of teenagers, a group of them with spiked Technicolor hairdos, stared mesmerized at the pictures on the screen. With Hira and Konar by his side, Chashran stepped up silently behind them. In 35 years, it seemed the humans had made few real advances in their technology. Clearly, they were still far too primitive to be a threat. Even so, Chashran was faintly amused by the drama unfolding on the television screens. It was a crude representation of a space battle between the Earthlings and some unseen enemy. The humans, vain creatures that they were, showed themselves winning the confrontation. Chashran smiled thinly at the irony of it. On the screen, the interior of the Earth-ship shuddered. Consoles rained sparks. One of the actors fell, and another actor rushed to kneel over him.
"He's dead, Jim,"
one of the boys said in a shrill falsetto voice that was in perfect sync with the actor, who silently mouthed his line. The group laughed and nudged each other. As they did, one of them caught sight of Chashran. Soon the whole group was staring. Someone imitated a chimpanzee. Another made jungle bird calls. A third giggled. Chashran and his soldiers shifted their attention from the television sets to the punks. The giggler fell silent. Slowly, silently, the teenagers moved on. It was time for Chashran and the others to leave as well. The advocate had come up with a suggestion that was actually intelligent, which indicated to Chashran that it was Khan's doing. These host bodies were deteriorating far too quickly, causing almost as much alarm as it would for them to use their natural form. Apparently, their cellular structure made it impossible for them to tolerate large doses of radiation. Therefore, the advocacy decreed it was necessary to obtain medical information on caring for the human bodies. The method of doing so had been left to Chashran's discretion. In the meantime, Khana and the others had work of their own. Waller's Amoco lay south of exit 92 outside the little desert town. It was twilight, and the heat was fading. Old Doc Waller was just getting ready to lock up the office when he spied Orel Ralston weaving down the road. "Doc!" Orel spotted him and waved wildly. The action knocked him off balance, and he reacted by staggering off to one side. He had just left Nelda's tavern a half-mile down the road and was drunk as a skunk. Doc gave up and slipped his key back into his pocket without locking the office door. Orel was running early this evening. Usually he didn't reach this particular level of intoxication until well after nightfall, after Doc had left the station, at which point Orel would stumble from Nelda's down to the Amoco and climb into one of the cars left overnight for maintenance, where he'd sleep off his drunk and leave the next morning by 7:30, before Doc and the customers started showing up. Doc didn't mind, really. So long as Orel was gone before the customers got there and didn't piss or upchuck in any of the cars, it was no problem. Doc had made it plenty clear that the night Orel puked in a customer's car would be his last. "Doc!" Orel panted, arriving at last, and grasped the old man's upper arms. Orel was a short, weasel-faced little guy with a round nose and shiny eyes the color of the American flag, red, white, and blue. And he smelled worse than a wet dog. His overalls and the holy white t-shirt he wore beneath them were filthy, as was the greasy red-brown hair he brushed forward in an attempt to hide a receding hairline. "Doc, how are you?" His breath was sour from beer. "You're early tonight, Oral." Doc pried Oral's dirty hands loose and put an arm under his shoulders to prop him up. "Come on over this way. I got a nice 79 Ford LTD with some really cushy seats." Oral balked. "Don't want to sleep," he slurred. "Ain't tired. How about you bringing us a couple of beers?" He was referring to the cooler Doc kept hidden behind the counter in the office. Doc kept it stocked with Pabst Blue Ribbon in the can, or Coors if it was on special that week at the Brewster Safeway. Sometimes, when things got too slow, Doc would pop open a can for himself, and sometimes, if he was feeling especially generous, for the part-time mechanic, Luis Ortega. Of course, he never dreamed of doing it when there were customers around. "Cooler's empty," Doc lied, though he knew there were a couple of Paps still left in the melted ice. "Come on, Oral, let's check out that LTD." Oral yielded and wobbled along with Doc's help over to the four-door LTD. It was unlocked, of course. In 40 years, Doc had never locked a car or truck on his property, and none of them had ever been stolen or vandalized. The LTD was white with a black vinyl top that was starting to peel away from the metal in a couple of places. Otherwise, it looked pretty good for a 79, though Doc couldn't say the same for the transmission. Doc opened the heavy rear door. Lord, they didn't make 'em like this anymore. Now they had those little tinfoil Japanese cars that crumpled if you looked cross-eyed at 'em, and eased Oral inside. Oral curled up on the rear seat, real leather, nice and cushy, with a contented sigh. Doc had parked it in the shade and kept the windows cracked so the air inside would be fresh and not too hot. Luis had given him a hard time about it that morning, but Doc felt sorry for old Oral. Oral's 17-year-old daughter, Sally, had died of leukemia 4 years ago, and afterward, Oral's wife, Minnie, had gone off the deep end. They said she was still in some kind of mental hospital off in Riverside or somewhere, but Oral didn't talk about it anymore. A lot of kids had died of leukemia around here, and the old folks of one kind or another of cancer. Enough to make folks suspicious. All that nuclear testing back in the 50s, everyone said. And when that group of families decided to sue the U.S. government, people in Brewster talked of joining the suit or starting their own. Of course, after those folks lost the case, people here gave up talking about it. Doc's own wife, Lucy, had died of breast cancer 12 years before, when she was only 51, and he was 58. Since then, he'd just been marking time, minding the station, and having an occasional beer when the waiting got to weigh heavy on him. Just his damn luck he turned out to be long-lived. Without Lucy, life seemed flat and dry and endless, like the desert. He made sure Oral was clear of the door, then closed it, and headed back to the office to lock up. He'd just turned the key in the lock when he heard the tractor-trailer rumbling down the exit ramp. "Damn," Doc sighed. But he opened the door, switched on the lights, then walked around the counter to switch on the diesel pump. Business wasn't so good that he could afford to turn down big rigs like the one pulling into the station. Shiny and new it was, not a scratch on it. No writing on the sign, neither, and when Doc saw the guy in the white coverall climb out and start pumping diesel into one of the tanks, he became a tad suspicious. A worker at one of them nuclear dump places for sure. He bet if somebody took a Geiger counter and aimed it at that rig, the needle would go clear off the scale. Doc hated those places, and the people from them who stopped by. In the back of his mind, he blamed them for Lucy's death. Still, business was business. Doc walked out of the office and ambled on over to the island. The guy in the coverall had his back to him and didn't notice him. "Why don't you let me do that, fella?" Doc inquired cheerfully as soon as he was in earshot. "This here's a full-service station." Without turning around, the man shook his head very slowly. "Have it your way." Doc replied pleasantly. "Where are you headed?" The man still didn't speak, but inclined his head back toward Route 15, going east. Luis came in 4 mornings a week and was gone after lunch. The rest of the time, Doc spent pretty much by himself, especially the evenings at home, which sometimes got rough. He enjoyed talking with his customers every chance he got. Felt it was his right. He refused to be discouraged into silence. "I see. Where are you coming from?" The man nodded west. "Talkative, ain't you?" Doc said, a little disgusted. "Here, I'll finish that up." He crossed over the island and reached out for the nozzle. Startled, the man turned toward him. Doc caught a whiff of something rotten. "Jesus H. Christ on a raft," he whispered, feeling a sudden strange tingle of fear. The man's face was deathly pale, a sick, graying color, and there was a huge oozing sore on his cheek that for some reason made him think of Lucy. Cancer, Doc thought, horrified. The poor fool's face was eaten away by it, and such a young man, too. "Son," he said kindly, "you best start being a heap more careful standing out in the sun like this without no hat." As he spoke, 2 others, a man and a woman, stepped down out of the cab. As they moved closer, Doc was struck by that same cloying, sickly sweet smell of vomit and decay and things too abominable to mention. There was puke down the front of their white coveralls, he realized, and dark streaks down the legs that he didn't even want to guess at. Their faces were covered with weeping sores, just like the guy at the pump. But it couldn't be that they all had the same type of cancer progressed to the same stage. Doc had had enough experience with the disease to realize it wasn't contagious. No, there was something else wrong with them, something even more horrible than the big C. Nervously, Doc took a big step backward. "You folks got some type of communicable disease or something?" No answer. Maybe they couldn't talk, Doc thought frantically, because their tongues had rotted off in there. Silently, the 2 began to move toward him, while the third continued to fill the big rig's tanks. The vile stench grew stronger. There was an evil purposefulness in the movements of the 2 that had made him tremble. In a brilliant, horrifying flash, Doc realized they were corpses. Walking corpses, much as Lucy had been in those awful final days. "No," he cried feebly, raising his hands in a pitiful attempt to ward off death. "Not like this." True, he took no joy in living anymore, but he'd planned on going quietly, dying in his sleep in his own bed, or maybe slumping over one day at the station, and the thought of joining these 3, of becoming as they were, here, now, terrified him. They kept coming, and he kept shrinking away, until at last he stepped back against something firm and moist and inhumanly strong. Oral stirred inside the big LTD. He was powerfully thirsty, and the drunk was beginning to wear off a bit, so that he remembered where he was. He grabbed onto the top of the back seat. Really was nice leather. Some faraway part of his brain realized. There was no better, kinder person in the world than old Doc Waller, and pulled himself up. Eyes still closed, he slowly peeled his cottony tongue away from the inside of his cheek. Damn, he was dry. But no point in asking for water, which would just sober him up again, and croaked, "Hey, Doc, what say we head over to Jed's for some moonshine?" Doc had actually gone with him once, not long after Lucy died, and they'd both gotten stinky drunk. Oral's memory wasn't too good these days, but he never forgot a detail when it came to drinking. It didn't come out loud enough for anyone to hear, so Oral cleared his throat and tried louder. "Doc?" He opened his eyes, forced them to focus, and peered out the back windshield. What he saw sobered him up fast. Oral blinked and shook his head to clear it, but the horrible scene remained. He sucked back a sob and sank soundlessly down, out of sight. Griff Kelsey slipped his shoes off and sat down in the black leather lazy boy recliner, the one Elaine had bought him for his 50th birthday 2 years ago, in front of the television set. From the TV tray beside him, Griff removed the small plastic square marked Physician's Sample and pushed 2 Empirin No. 4 through the foil, put them on his tongue, tilted his head back, and washed them down with a sip from the large, old-fashioned glass filled 3/4 of the way with Jack Daniels. Years of alcoholism had left their mark in the broken veins on his nose and cheeks, in the extra weight. He still took 2 No. 4s every evening around this time, even though the migraines he started taking them for had stopped 9 months before, when Elaine left him for that lawyer in Palm Springs. Now, he took them because the money was gone, and there was some young jerk over in Cadiz who'd set up what they called a family practice nowadays and was stealing all his patients. He also took them because Elaine had taken the Lincoln Town Car and the poodle. Good riddance, actually. And the entire damn savings account. She'd left him only the Grand Wagoneer, though he never used it for house calls anymore. And the house. It was a nice house, the ritziest one in Brewster, a sprawling Spanish villa with an authentic red tile roof and 2 dying palm trees out front. It was near the center of town, and he kept his shingle prominently displayed. Griffith W. Kelsey, M.D., General Practitioner. The arrow, underneath, pointed around to the side where the office entrance was. Used to be Griff was the only doctor for miles around, unless you wanted to drive the 45 minutes or so to Barstow or Hinckley. When he was growing up in Brewster, that's exactly what people had to do if they needed to see the doctor. Griff vowed to change all that. He went off to Arizona State, then to medical school, which he barely made it through, graduating dead last in his class, and came right back to Brewster the minute he finished his residency at a Las Vegas hospital. After all, he figured the only doctor for 30 miles around was bound to make potfuls of money, which was exactly what he did until Elaine took him to the cleaners, and that new doctor in Cadiz stole all his patients. On bad days, when there were no patients or only 1 or 2, he took a Valium along with the Empirins. But today actually hadn't gone too badly. 9 patients and all but 1 paid cash. Griff celebrated by putting his favorite Swansons in the oven, turkey with dressing and apple crunch for dessert, though he wished there were some way to keep the cranberries from getting so hot they burned his tongue. Waiting for the kitchen timer to go off, he settled back in the recliner and pulled the levers so the footrest came out, then picked up the remote control on the padded armrest and flicked the TV on to the cable news channel. He sipped the Jack and listened with vague interest. An item from Atlanta. Blood mysteriously seeping up through the floorboards in an elderly widow's home. Police mystified. 3 more Palestinians killed on the West Bank. Slow news day. They were talking about the bond market rally when he heard the noise. Not the kind where you have to ask yourself if you really heard something or not, but a boom, the sound of someone breaking the door down, and it had come from the other side of the house, where the office was. Griff pushed the footrest back and struggled to his feet, spilling Jack down the front of his white professional smock. He set the glass down on the tray. His heart was thumping so wildly in his chest that he couldn't catch his breath. Someone had broken into the office. The fear was nauseating in its intensity. It was a possibility that had always worried him. A thief or an addict searching for drugs. A few years back, he'd talked to Elaine about getting a fancy security system for the house, especially the office. She'd scoffed at him. "There aren't any junkies in Brewster, present company accepted." "No," he'd answered, "but there were plenty of them traveling between L.A. and Vegas." "And they're going to bother to take the exit and come all the way out here, to the middle of goddamn nowhere to look for excitement? Dream on." She talked him out of it, of course. The money he would have spent on the expensive system now belonged to her and her precious attorney. It was just one more reason to hate her. Griff ran softly back to the bedroom and pulled the .44 Magnum out from under an unfolded pile of underwear in his top dresser drawer. He always kept it loaded, and now he took the safety off and held it close to him as he picked up the phone and dialed 911. Someone came on the line, and he gave him his name, address, and said, "A burglar's just broken into the house. Get the sheriff out here, fast." But the sheriff could be anywhere in San Bernardino County right now, and although the 911 operator promised 20 minutes, Griff knew better. He kept the Magnum held high as he walked, perspiring, down the dim hallway. Maybe it'd be best to just stay put until Sheriff Deke got there. Just let him take whatever they wanted. After all, he was fully insured. But then, there were thousands of dollars worth of samples in the supply cabinet in his office, and all of his Imperion and Valium. He'd be damned before he'd let them wipe him out. The door to the office wing was closed, but Griff thought he could hear someone 2 rooms down, in the waiting room. He turned the knob noiselessly and slipped inside the darkened back room he used as his private office. The supply closet was just off this room. Griff felt a twinge of relief. So far, the samples were safe. Beyond the office lay a short corridor that led either directly across to the examination room or out to the tiny foyer he used as a waiting room. Footsteps. A thump. Sounds of someone, something. Sounds not necessarily produced by a human body. Maybe it was some sort of animal. But what the hell kind of desert animal was capable of breaking down the door? Griff thrust the Magnum forward at arm's length, held his breath, and tiptoed out to the corridor. Beyond, in the waiting room, something moved in the shadows. He crept to the room's entrance and cried in a voice that cracked and shook, "I've got a gun, damn it! Get the hell out of there or I'll start shooting!" Silence. It was getting dark outside, but there was still barely enough light for Griff to make out a human form standing between himself and the wide-open door. And then a voice, low, harsh, a man's, and yet somehow inhuman. "We're ill. We need help." The words were articulated clumsily, as if the man's mouth were filled with pebbles, or part of his tongue were missing. Something the size of a mastiff, black, thick-bodied, skittered behind the intruder, off to one side. An attack dog, Griff thought. But he didn't hear any panting or growling. "Need help my foot," he said. The fact that the man sounded ill and weak gave him a small amount of courage. "You need help? Use the goddamn doorbell." He fumbled with his free hand against the wall and found the switch. "I'm going to turn on the light. Make one move and you're dead." He snapped it on. He had been a doctor for 25 years, could drain an abscess or stitch up a cut between bites of a sandwich without losing his appetite, but the sight of the man made him cry out, a voiceless gasp. The skin on his face had degenerated into one huge open weeping sore. Griff had seen enough photographs of victims of radiation sickness in Hiroshima to know what was wrong with the man, and his first thought was, too far gone. He's been exposed to a lethal amount. The second thought was that there'd been some sort of terrible catastrophe at a nearby nuclear power plant. The man wore a white technician's jumpsuit, which was stained with vomit and diarrhea. Griff's third thought was that anyone at this stage of radiation sickness should have been far too weak to force the door open. "We need your help," the man repeated in the same gravelly voice. His eyes sparkled with fever. "All right, buddy." Griff gestured at him with the Magnum. "We'll talk about that in a minute. Where'd the dog go?" The man stared uncomprehendingly at him and took a step forward. Griff compensated by moving back. The guy was probably hot with radioactivity himself. "Come on," he said impatiently. "Where's the dog, or whatever it was you brought with you?" The man took another step toward Griff. Griff took aim again, tightened his finger on the trigger. "I mean it." His pitch rose. "Stop, or I'll shoot!" Another step. He backed away and was about to pull the trigger when something whip-like whistled through the air and fastened itself around his neck once, twice, and squeezed like a boa constrictor. Griff gasped as the air was forced out of him. The magnum went off, sending a bullet into the thick pile carpeting. There was a hot, searing pain that covered his face, his torso, as if he were drowning in acid, that made Griff scream. It was followed by the sensation of something moving inside him, pressing against his internal organs, moving up inside his head. Pressure. Horrible mounting pressure inside his skull, increasing beyond his ability to bear it, until he was sure his brain, his skull, would explode. He felt his mind dimming like a flame dying for lack of oxygen, smothered by a flood of strange thoughts not his own.
"We need you,"
the man said again.